So, you're on your period. You need something to control the blood. What do? Well, what if I told you that one option is a wooden tampon you stick up there? Or maybe you'd like to visit your local psychiatrist because clearly the period cramps you are experiencing must be something psychological and, quite frankly, hysterical, right? Doesn't sound good? Yeah, I did not think so. But that was more or less an example of how periods, or menstruation, have been dealt with for millennia. Today I'm doing a deep dive into the history of menstruation and how it has been viewed in human history. Welcome to Feminist Framework, the big sister to my Instagram series called Feminist Fridays. My name is Camilla and I have an academic background as an intellectual historian. Yes, that is the name of those studies: feminist studies, religion, and Hebrew, and I shall share what I know with you because I think we need to broaden our historical information to include more of the human history than what we have been introduced to for so very long. So, if you would like to learn more about history from another perspective, stay a while. All right, let's get back to the bloody business. What are periods anyways? Menstruation is the regular discharge of blood and mucosal tissue from the inner lining of the uterus through the vagina. The menstrual cycle is characterized by the rise and fall of hormones. It is triggered by falling progesterone levels and is a sign that pregnancy has not occurred. According to the NHS, menstruation usually starts around age 12, but they can also start as early as age 8. Personally, I got mine when I was 11. Generally, there is a range of 28 days between each menstruation and bleeding lasts between 2 to 7 days. Menstruation and hormones go hand in hand. People who menstruate may therefore also feel hormonal and emotional changes within themselves up to their periods. This is called PMS, which stands for Premenstrual Syndrome. Symptoms of PMS are typically irritability, headache, breast tenderness, bloating, mood swings, anxiety, depression, and anger. Because of the hormonal aspects of menstruations, it is quite common for bleeders to feel some sort of cramp or pain leading up to and/or during their menstruation. This is because the hormonal aspect of this affects the muscles in the uterus that therefore contracts. This phenomenon is called dysmenorrhea. So, to summarize, if you menstruate, it means you are dealing with a bloody situation from your uterus around once a month. It can be painful, you can be heavily affected mood-wise, and may feel sad or angry, seemingly out of nowhere and for no particular reason. So what is the big deal with all this? People bleed and it can be a nuisance, but so what? Is that a problem? Well, maybe. Let's take a look at the historical aspect of this. Menstruation a long time ago. Before we take any steps towards our shared past, we must establish one thing. History has not been written by all those who lived it. It has been written down by a few people who had access to things the majority of people did not, such as education, stability, money, security. It has also primarily been written by cis men, meaning that when it comes to matters, personal or societal, of those who were not indeed cis male, of the same class and status as the ones who wrote down the events of their time, our source material is severely lacking. This means that in many cases we are unfortunately guessing a lot and relying on source material that is, in the established historical circles, not all seen as proper historical material. If you are interested in this particular subject about who wrote history and where we can find a more true and representative representation of our own past, then let me know in the comments below. I actually have written a chapter about this in a book published here in Denmark in regards to my own field of intellectual history. But for now, I will leave it at this and say that source material and menstruation is a tricky union. We have some pieces of information about periods in ancient times. Take, for example, ancient Egypt. It is suspected that bleeders of this time used papyrus for a tampon-like device. Some other sources say that it was also common to see people use a wooden stick covered in wool or lint as a tampon, but I have to say that this is probably a myth spread by a tampon company later on, which I will therefore share as a cautionary tale of what happens when we lack source material and then also want to sell something in modern times. In my intro to this very video, I shared this wooden stick as something you could, so know that it is probably a myth. Wooden sticks and your downstairs area does not sound rather pleasant anyway, so I cannot imagine that has been a true reliable option. If we move up in time a little and see what was done about menstruation in the medieval age of Europe, then we must make a quick halt first. We need to read something quite important in the Bible because this is part of the reason why periods and all things that have to do with it have been filled with shame and secrecy for so many years. We need to visit the old text and read in Leviticus. Here is what it says. Whenever a woman has her menstrual period, she will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touches her during that time will be unclean until evening. Anything on which the woman lies or sits during the time of her period will be unclean. If any of you touch her bed, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. If you touch any object she has sat on, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. This includes her bed or any other object she has sat on. You will be unclean until evening if you touch it. If a man has sexual intercourse with her and her blood touches him, her menstrual impurity will be transmitted to him. He will remain unclean for 7 days, and any bed on which he lies will be unclean. So basically, we here have a biblical text that established that when someone is bleeding, a function one has no control over, that is a biological and natural aspect of having a uterus, then that someone is unclean and thus less than the ones who do not bleed. Aha! It is also said that if you, a non-bleeder, touch something that the bleeder has touched, well, then you're unclean too. What this is actually saying, or rather what this actually meant and still means today, is that those who bleed are to be kept separate from the rest of society. They represent something that is so fundamentally not good that they have to be treated as outcasts. Even though many people do not practice these literal statements from religious texts, the legacy is enormous and cannot just like that be erased. If you don't believe me, take a look at this. According to menstrualhygieneday.org, nearly half of US women have experienced so-called period shaming. A study found that 58% of women have felt a sense of embarrassment simply because they were on their period. 42% of women have experienced period shaming, with 1 in 5 being made to have these feelings because of comments made by a male friend. Additionally, 12% of women have been shamed by a family member and 1 in 10 by a classmate. 44% of the men admit to having made a joke about or comment on a partner's mood when she was on her period. More than half of the men studied believed it is inappropriate for women to openly mention their menstrual cycles in the workplace. The list goes on, and if you want to see it for yourself, I have left a link for you down below. So the shame of having a period goes way back, and that leads us back to the Middle Ages of Europe. The shame was also very present here in a society that was heavily controlled by the church. We have source material that says that scholars of the time viewed menstruation as a direct link to Eve and the sin she brought into the world according to the Christian faith. Menstruation was seen as very important for the health of the person bleeding. If one was not pregnant and thus not bleeding, One had to find another way to separate oneself from the blood because it was believed this held the balance of the fluids, which was deemed very important. Even when this was the case, the very discharge of menstruation was viewed as a negative process that was the part of the bleeder's weakness and lack of worth. When it comes to the Renaissance period, menstruation was now used in empirical studies. Menstruation was thoroughly researched in view of its toxicity. Menstruation blood was also connected to astrology, theology, magic, and humoral pathology, which is the system of medicine detailing a supposed makeup and workings of the human body adopted by ancient Greek and Roman physicians and philosophers. The Enlightenment period dissolved the worldviews of the past and a new mechanic worldview took over. Nature was now chaotic and dangerous and was deemed something that should be fought and controlled. The two genders were more radically separated than previously and were now viewed as totally different with different abilities. Women were in this regard viewed as creatures with specific natural laws that were to be studied and systemically controlled. Now, I say women here, but I want to emphasize that woman is a broad term. There are more than two genders and there always have been, so please keep that in mind. Back to the Enlightenment. Women were still seen as less than men, not so much because of the sin they all carried stemming from Eve and the Bible, but rather because of their close relationship and kinship with nature that was, as mentioned, dangerous and wild. Menstruation could be seen as an unhealthy and bad consequence of civilization. It could be because women ate too much or because of her lack of physical activity, or maybe even the way society had decided her sexuality should be. In the 19th and 20th century, the difference of the woman was also underlined, but now more in an evolutionist and social Darwinistic way. Menstruation and the act of bleeding was seen as something pathological, even if it was indeed natural. It was more like a necessary evil. Now the link between menstruation and reproduction was properly made. In 1920, a professor observed that the roses his gardener had cut for a bouquet withered unnaturally fast. He then asked the gardener about it and realized that the gardener had been having a menstruation whilst they had cut the flowers, which led the professor to conclude that menstruation contained toxins. More scientific studies came to the same conclusion, and it was only in the 1950s that it was finally disproved that menstruation is a toxin. So what about now? Periods are still something those who have them have to deal with. The pain is still there, the PMS, the blood, and so is the shame, I think. I don't know about you, but when I was in school, it was a common practice for all those who bled that we would keep our pads hidden within our sleeves or pockets so no one could see we were in fact bleeding. The shame of having to change my pad at the school bathroom still sits in me because the sound of that ripping noise was the clearest indication that I, the one in the booth, was bleeding from my uterus. I did this video topic on my Instagram a while back in my series there called Feminist Fridays, and I asked what kind of shame the people there felt or still feel when it comes to their periods. I want to ask you the same, because it started a very interesting conversation between people all over the world and of many different ages. So, what kind of emotion do you have in regards to your period? Is it something you discuss freely with your friends and family? Or do you try to hide it? What about buying period products? Does it bring you shame? Or do you not care at all? Before I go for today, I want to mention that this video has dealt with menstruation in a historical aspect, and so I have not talked about the term period poverty, which is a huge issue for people who bleed. The term means the lack of education about menstruation, insufficient hygiene facilities, and access to products. It affects millions of people and can impact in many ways, such as missing days of school or work, health problems, and more. There is a link in my description below with more information about this. I personally every month pay an amount to a charity here in Denmark that goes toward period products for bleeding people in refugee camps. I don't know if this is something that you can do too, but if you have the means, please consider it. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Feminist Framework. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know by liking and subscribing and all that jazz. I will try to be more present here on YouTube, so if you enjoy this, I will create more. Thank you for being here. Stay feminist.